Do you remember those cheap meals black mothers cooked made from little but filled with love? In the 1960s, they fed families through struggle and strength. What do those flavors still whisper about how they endured? Neckbone stew was a pot of patience and love. Black mothers knew how to take the cheapest cut of meat and turn it into something that could feed everyone. Neckbones were bony, fatty, and far from tender. But slow cooking changed everything. They'd brown them in a heavy pot with onions and garlic, letting the aroma fill the kitchen long before supper was ready. Then came potatoes, carrots, and a sprinkle of whatever spices were on hand, often just salt, pepper, and a hint of bay. The broth thickened slowly, rich with collagen and depth, until every bone gave up its flavor. The meat clung to the bone, tender and silky, floating in a sauce that seemed to hug each vegetable. Children would watch the pot simmer, knowing that when it was done, there'd be enough to go around. In homes where every dollar mattered, this dish proved that care could make abundance out of scarcity. It wasn't fancy, but it was real food, filling, warm, and made to last. Every bowl carried the memory of the cook's hands and the sound of laughter echoing from the table. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that breakfast didn't need money to taste good. It began with leftover grits or cornmeal porridge, cooled overnight until firm. The next morning, it was sliced thick and fried in a bit of grease until each piece turned golden and crisp on the outside, soft and creamy inside. Mothers served it with syrup, molasses, or gravy depending on what the day called for. The crackle of cornmeal in the pan was the sound of thrift at work, using what was left to make something new again. It filled bellies before long walks to school or shifts at work, giving warmth that stuck through the morning. Fried cornmeal mush wasn't just a dish. It was a rhythm, a morning ritual built from yesterday's effort. It made sure nothing went to waste, and everyone started the day with something to smile about. Sweet, savory, or somewhere in between, it was a small joy that cost almost nothing but meant everything. Pinto beans and cornbread was a meal that carried generations. Pinto beans simmered for hours with salt pork or a leftover ham bone until the broth grew thick and smoky. The cornbread baked in cast iron, crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, waiting to soak up every drop. This was more than food. It was a way of surviving with dignity. For many families, a pot of beans could last 2 or 3 days, with each reheating somehow tasting even better. Black mothers made sure the pot never ran dry, stirring as they talked, prayed, or planned the week ahead. Beans filled the home with a smell of comfort and quiet pride. It was protein, flavor, and history, all built from a few cents worth of ingredients. Eating together, they'd crumble cornbread into their bowls, letting it soak until it became a stew of sorts, warm, familiar, sustaining. In that simple mix of beans and bread lived proof that home cooking could be both humble and holy. Hogshead hash was a breakfast that spoke to the no-waste mentality of African American cooking traditions that valued resourcefulness and respect for food. When a hog was butchered, nothing was left unused, and the head provided meat that could be stewed, chopped, seasoned, and fried into hearty dishes. Families would mix the shredded meat with potatoes, onions, and sometimes peppers, then cook it together in a skillet until browned, crispy, and richly flavored. The flavor was intense, smoky, and savory, and it filled the house with a smell that lingered long after breakfast was finished. It was not just food, but a reminder of how creativity and resourcefulness made survival possible in communities where every scrap mattered. Children grew up eating it without complaint because it was hearty, flavorful, and kept them full through school, farm work, or chores. Adults relied on it as a way to honor the animal by using every part of it, ensuring nothing went to waste. Though hogshead hash has nearly vanished from today's kitchens, it once stood as a powerful symbol of resilience, thrift, and respect for tradition that sustained families. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Ashcake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ashcake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Fried catfish and cornbread was a breakfast plate that reflected the abundance of rivers and the skill of African American cooks in the South. Catfish could be caught at little cost, cleaned, coated in cornmeal, and fried crisp in cast-iron skillets. Paired with hot cornbread fresh from the oven, the meal was both hearty and nourishing. It gave workers the energy needed for long days in the fields, and children the strength to get through school without hunger. Families often made it on weekends when fishing provided enough to share with neighbors, turning it into a communal meal. The taste was bold and rustic, with a combination of crunchy fish and soft bread that defined comfort. Though fish is not often associated with breakfast today, fried catfish and cornbread once stood proudly on morning tables. It remains a reflection of resilience and resourcefulness, showing how nature and tradition came together to sustain communities. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrappin' soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Collard green omelet was a breakfast born from thrift and the habit of making yesterday's leftovers stretch. Collard greens, usually cooked long and slow with seasoning, were often tucked into eggs the next morning, creating a dish that was both frugal and flavorful. Families valued it because it made use of what they already had, ensuring nothing went to waste. The combination of tender greens with fluffy eggs gave a balance of nutrition and satisfaction. For children, it was a familiar flavor carried into a new form, while adults enjoyed the heartiness without requiring more expensive meat. It was a dish that tied breakfast to dinner, blending the rhythms of the household kitchen into one continuous cycle of reuse. Betty Crocker kitchens may have praised convenience, but African-American homes thrived on this kind of ingenuity. Collard green omelets are rare today, but they once carried the quiet wisdom of making much from little and starting mornings strong. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Red gravy with rice was a breakfast dish that combined economy with comfort in African-American households. The gravy was made from tomatoes, onions, and seasoning, simmered until thick and poured over steaming rice. It was filling, affordable, and deeply satisfying, providing warmth and energy to carry through the day. For many families, rice was cheaper than bread and could be stretched to feed everyone, while tomatoes added both flavor and color. The dish was common across the South, where it became a daily staple for working people who needed hearty food before long hours of labor. Children often grew up with it as a familiar morning ritual, while adults valued its reliability and ease of preparation. Red gravy with rice was never fancy, but it symbolized resilience and the ability to make simple ingredients carry meaning. Though rarely served in breakfast form today, it was once a proud and practical tradition. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Field pea cakes were one of those breakfast recipes that reflected both creativity and frugality. Leftover field peas would be mashed and mixed with cornmeal, onion, and a touch of seasoning, then shaped into patties and fried until crisp. They were simple to prepare and stretched whatever little was left from dinner into the morning meal. For farming families, peas were easy to grow and store, making them a dependable staple. The patties were hearty enough to satisfy hunger and could be eaten plain or alongside bread, syrup, or even a bit of bacon when available. The texture was soft inside with a crunchy crust that made them appealing to both children and adults. Field pea cakes spoke to the ingenuity of cooks who made sure nothing went to waste. They were not just thrifty, but also delicious, proving that even the simplest ingredients could be turned into a breakfast worth remembering. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Hog maw and potatoes was a breakfast that carried both weight and flavor for households that needed energy for the day ahead. Hog maw, or hog stomach, was cleaned carefully, seasoned, and slow-cooked until tender. Potatoes were added to the pot, soaking up the rich broth and spices as they simmered together. The result was a dish that was hearty, savory, and deeply satisfying, often eaten in large portions to provide strength before long hours in the fields or factories. Though not a delicacy, it was respected because it made use of parts of the hog that otherwise might have been discarded. The combination of meat and potatoes provided both protein and comfort, ensuring that families started their mornings with something filling. Hog maw and potatoes reflected resilience, turning less desirable cuts into meals that carried pride and tradition. Though it is rarely seen on tables today, it once served as a dependable morning staple. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Fish roe and onions was a breakfast plate that reflected the close ties African American communities had with rivers and local fishing. Roe sacks were cleaned and seasoned, then pan-fried in lard or butter until firm and golden. Onions were fried alongside, adding sweetness and balancing the rich flavor of the roe. The combination was eaten hot, often with bread or cornbread, creating a meal that was hearty and protein-rich. It was not a glamorous dish, but it was reliable and nutritious, making it an important breakfast in households that lived close to waterways. Roe was affordable compared to other proteins, and using it showed the resourcefulness of cooks who relied on what was readily available. Though not common today, fish roe and onions once held a respected place at the table, carrying both sustenance and tradition. Soot biscuits were the kind of food you learned to trust when the fire was all you had. They were baked in soot-covered Dutch ovens, set right into the coals until the smell of toasted flour filled the air. The outsides came out black and charred, but inside they were soft, warm, and sweet from the faint taste of smoke. You brushed off the ash and split them open, steam rising like a small blessing. They were eaten with syrup, molasses, or even gravy if the morning allowed it. Families traveling, camping, or working the land knew this trick well. It was food that came straight from the earth and fire, raw and honest. Soot biscuits did not look like much, but they carried pride. They were proof that comfort could come from the simplest effort, that even ashes could feed the body and soothe the soul. The smell lingered on your hands and clothes, a reminder that good things sometimes came wrapped in smoke. Each bite tasted like work and gratitude, the flavor of survival baked in real flame. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Wild berry dumplings were a breakfast that came directly from the land. Foraged berries like blackberries, blueberries, or mulberries were gathered in the early morning, often by children who knew where the best patches grew. The berries were simmered into a sweet syrup, and then simple dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the pot. As they cooked, the dumplings soaked up the berry flavor, becoming plump, soft, and comforting. This was not a dish you would find in restaurants, but one that carried the taste of summer mornings in rural communities. It was affordable, relying only on what nature provided and a handful of pantry staples. Families looked forward to it during berry season, enjoying a breakfast that blended sweetness and tradition. The dumplings were eaten straight from bowls, sometimes with a little milk poured over the top to stretch the meal further. Wild berry dumplings were proof that even foraged food could feel like a feast. Hominy crackle porridge was the kind of breakfast that came from patience, not plenty. When there was no bacon, no biscuits, and not much else in the pantry, leftover hominy saved the day. It was stirred into a pot with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if you had it. The sound of the spoon scraping against the pot made a rhythm that felt almost like music, slow and steady like morning itself. When the porridge bubbled, it released a scent both earthy and rich, a blend of smoke, sugar, and warmth. Children would sit waiting with chipped bowls in their hands, ready for the first ladle. It was thick and creamy, sometimes with a thin golden crust if it sat long enough. Hominy crackle porridge filled bellies and lifted moods, turning scraps into something special. It reminded families that sweetness did not depend on sugar alone, but on love and endurance. Every spoonful was a story of thrift and tenderness, made from what was left and shared without complaint. When the bowl was empty, people still felt full, not just from the food, but from the comfort it brought to a hard world made softer by care. Pumpkin cornbread pancakes were a seasonal breakfast that brought warmth and flavor to the table, while also highlighting the importance of harvest traditions. Pumpkin puree was mixed into cornmeal batter, creating pancakes that were tender, slightly sweet, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg when available. They were cooked on hot griddles, often in heavy cast-iron pans, filling kitchens with the rich scent of autumn mornings and harvest season comfort. Served with syrup, molasses, or even a small pat of butter, they were both filling and affordable, making them a treasured staple in many homes. Pumpkins were easy to grow in gardens and easy to store through winter, making them a natural addition to recipes when fresh produce was scarce. Cornmeal, a constant in African American kitchens, stretched the batter and made the pancakes accessible to families of every size. Children especially looked forward to these pancakes, as they added color and flavor to the usual breakfast fare. Pumpkin cornbread pancakes carried tradition, thrift, and creativity, turning everyday ingredients into something that felt festive and memorable. They were a reminder of how seasons shaped the table and how families found joy in simple shared meals that carried both memory and resilience. Dandelion green hash was a breakfast that showed the importance of foraging and making use of what the land offered. Dandelion greens, often dismissed as weeds, were gathered fresh and sautéed with onions in a skillet until tender. Potatoes or eggs were sometimes added when available, stretching the dish into something more filling. The greens had a slightly bitter flavor that balanced with the sweetness of onions and the richness of whatever fat was used for cooking. For families with little money, dandelion green hash provided vitamins, comfort, and a hot plate of food without requiring much expense. It carried tradition too, as elders passed down the knowledge of which wild plants could be eaten and how to prepare them. Children might not have loved the bitterness, but they grew up with it as part of their everyday lives. Dandelion green hash was more than thrift. It was a reminder that resilience often comes straight from the soil. Collard green Potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of Potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Wild grape connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape stands as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Sorrel hibiscus tea brought a ruby glow to church socials and summer porch gatherings. Its tart floral flavor, steeped from dried hibiscus petals and sweetened with cane sugar, reflected Caribbean influences that African American families carried north and west during migrations. Grandmothers brewed the tea in large enamel pots, sometimes adding a hint of ginger or a squeeze of lime to brighten the taste. Children watched the deep red liquid swirl into pitchers, knowing it signaled a special occasion. Served chilled over cracked ice in simple glasses, sorrel tea cooled guests during humid evenings while hymns and laughter filled the air. The drink offered more than refreshment. It was a quiet connection to ancestors and homelands across the sea. Over time, soda and store-bought beverages replaced the careful steeping of petals and spices, and the vibrant tradition faded in many communities. Those who still make it treasure the deep crimson reminder of resilience and shared history that once colored every celebration. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a Southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and old-world methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist, while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small-batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among Southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in Southern pantries today. Homemade cornmeal pancakes for supper were another way families stretched basic ingredients into a filling meal. Flour, cornmeal, lard, and milk came together in a batter that fried into golden cakes on a hot skillet. My grandmother served them stacked, drizzled with syrup if any was available, or eaten plain with butter when syrup was gone. The pancakes were fluffy yet hearty, giving enough energy to hold a family until morning. They cost next to nothing but fed many, which was exactly what mattered most. Children loved the sweetness when syrup was added, while adults appreciated the sheer substance of the cakes. In the 1960s, cornmeal pancakes were a staple when meat was scarce, turning humble ingredients into something warm and reliable. It was comfort food born of necessity, one of those meals that never left memory even as times changed. Homemade cornmeal pancakes carried the spirit of thrift, filling plates with love and survival. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. So which of these humble 1960s kitchen treasures do you remember most? Drop your favorite in the comments, share a little love with that like button, and hit subscribe so we can keep cooking up more stories straight from the heart.